All right, great. So Dr. Akra, welcome to the talk today. And to all of you, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from whichever part of the world you're signing in from. And welcome to the EU MDR Impending Requirements talk by Dr. Basil Akra, presented by 3Aware. My name is Kalideep Chaudhary, and I'm the EVP of Business Development. And together with my colleague, Dr. Emilia Hufford, will act as your host for today's session. Before this talk begins, I would like to go over a few structural elements. There are 300 people that have signed in, more than 300 people that have signed in from across the world. So in order to make this session as productive as possible, we've kept ample time for question and answers in the end. Please feel free to submit those questions via the chat box at the bottom of your screen. In addition, this talk is being recorded and will be made available to you via a link along with the PDF of the slides. So with that, let me spend a few minutes introducing 3Aware and our plans to radically disrupt the status quo in medtech compliance. As you all know, the new medical device regulations from the EU are going to lead to an unsustainable cost of compliance that will affect all of medtech. This increased time and cost of compliance is going to be greater than 5% of the annual sales in the EU region. Let that sink in for a second. The increased cost of compliance is going to be greater than 5% of the annual sales in the EU region. And what does it mean to you? It means that if medtech is unable to meet the cost and time of compliance, there's a real danger of these devices being withdrawn from the market. And so 3Aware was specifically created to address this impending need. We are a marriage of data science and clinical science that utilizes AI to drive, mine, curate, and analyze structured and unstructured notes from electronic health data from multiple administrative systems, linking tens of millions of patients to tens of thousands of your specific devices with longitudinal experiences, procedures, and outcomes. And so we use AI not just to automate a critical process, but also to uncover important insights. Before 3Aware, clinical teams spent 90% of the time and effort searching and evaluating through millions of rows of data and unwieldy spreadsheets. And now with the help of 3Aware, the same teams get immediate access to relevant cohorts with all the required contents in a scientific workbench that's designed to optimize productivity and insights. So what does the 3Aware process look like? Well, you would come to us with, say, a specific device that we'll drill down to the catalog number. We tell you not only how many patients are linked to that device, but how many device events have been recorded, the procedures that have been carried out, the ages of the patients. In short, everything that's needed for you to achieve and maintain compliance and keep your product on the market. And so what you're getting is an immediate access to patients that have been treated with your device, all followed longitudinally. So you can track how the device performs over time. And so our scientific workbench provides the interpretation and curation of structured and unstructured notes, all designed to optimize productivity and insights. And so compared to methods that you're familiar with, such as surveys, which are notorious for poor data quality, or prospective clinical study, which are known to take time and money, 3Aware platform delivers the greatest value per cost and time. 1/3 the cost and 1/10 the time of current approaches. And so with that, I would like to conclude by talking about a PMCF optimized platform that curates real-world data from provider notes, structured and unstructured, providing you with compliance at 1/3 the cost and 1/10 the time of current approaches. The landscape of compliance is changing, and 3Aware can help you optimize productivity and insights. So let me switch gears now. No one is more aware of the changing landscape than our speaker. And there's a reason why more than 300 people have signed in from all across the world to hear him speak. His accolades are too numerous to list here, but he is the CEO of Team Accra, and I'm very proud to say that he's the head of a scientific advisory board at 3Aware. Dr. Accra played an essential role during the implementation of the medical device regulations in Europe. He was involved in the drafting of several European guidance documents and has spent the last few years training and educating various stakeholders on EU legislation. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Basil Accra, who's going to talk to you about EU MDR, real-world evidence, data, and clinical evaluation requirements. Basil, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kalideep. Thank you, 3Aware, for inviting me to speak here as well about the European legislation. And thank you for the attendees for being with us today to hear more about actually the role of real-world evidence and how this can be actually used to address some of the obligation and the requirement for the medical device regulation. Kalideep, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So a lot of you actually remember the timelines of the medical device regulations. So we keep talking about this troublemaker regulation, which is actually started years ago, and which became now really evident that it is a regulation which is connected with a lot of additional expectation, not just on new devices, but devices which were already on the market and devices which were actually deemed to be established, but now need to requalify and re-justify their availability on the union market and their CE marking. So every device is currently undergoing, as most of you know, a recertification, which is actually an initial certification based on the new legislation. Everyone is still talking about the medical device regulation as new because it is still not executed fully. And even so, it was published in 2017. As of today, we don't have a huge number of devices certified under the MDR that we can say the majority of devices are MDR certified. And this is connected with a lot of requirement connected with the MDR, with resources requirement of the MDR, with the fact that everything need to get a certification again, and also with the fact that a lot of testing, a lot of data collection need to be executed, ensuring MDR compliance before applying for MDR certification. Next slide, please. Now, one of the important aspect, and I think Kalideep during his opening spoke about that, and one of the implication of the MDR is actually the higher obligation and requirement on clinical data pre-market level and clinical data on a post-market level. The MDR include a lot of sections which include additional requirement, starting by the up-classification of some devices, moving to general safety and performance requirement, which are adding obligations such as obligation on devices which are software as medical devices and devices which are connected, for example, cybersecurity and so on. But the most critical part, which is always under discussion, regardless with which manufacturer you are talking to, is actually the clinical part, because this is where the regulation is telling us, again, if you have a device on the market, you need to have evidence. And if you have claims for your device, you need to support those claims by evidence. And if you have a device, you need to understand the functionality of that device over the time where the device is actually delivering its safety and performance. So we talk about the expected lifetime of a device. So it doesn't mean that you need to have clinical evidence just for getting a market access, but also having clinical evidence on a post-market level to confirm that actually your statement, your claims are validated by evidence. And as we promised you today, we promised to talk about also the opinion of the expert panel. And if we look to the expert panels and the opinions that were provided as of today, we don't have a large number of them, but we have 10 opinions which were publicly actually made accessible by the expert panel. And if you read through them, you're gonna see what I'm gonna tell you later on. the importance of having a good clinical strategy, the importance of looking to your clinical strategy, not just actually for getting a market access, but also on a post-market level to ensure that your device is continuously safe and continually performing as intended, enabling you to have a benefit risk conclusion, which is justifiable based on evidence and not just based on assumption and hope and wishes. Next slide, please. I will keep it very simple, and I will take actually the wording of the regulation, because I keep explaining to people the difference between a clinical evaluation and a clinical investigation. As of today, after actually 6 years of publication of the regulation, I still hear people telling me, I don't need a clinical evaluation for my device. It's a simple device. I think what we need to clarify, a clinical evaluation is needed for every device, regardless of your class, regardless of the simplicity of the device. And the clinical evaluation is nothing else than actually reviewing all clinically relevant information to be able to justify that your device is safe, performing as intended, and has a benefit risk conclusion which is in line with the current state of the art. And I mentioned a lot of wording now, which are actually leading to a lot of trouble when you discuss with notified bodies. And starting with safety, how much safe must the device be? What is actually the performance which is expected? What does it mean I'm comparing myself to current state of the art? All of these topics are always under discussion by manufacturers and notified bodies and regulators, because it is actually learnings that should be there since the MEDEF, because there was an extensive and detailed guidance which tried to help manufacturer understanding how you can actually define key safety and performance criteria, how you can use state of the art to compare your device to the current state of the art. But we are still seeing that this is actually still complex. Remember, clinical evaluation is always needed, and it's not the same like a clinical investigation. A clinical investigation is the fact, which would mean that you are collecting clinical data. Can we go to the next slide, please? Clinical data are data which you collect on one or more more patients via a study which you are running. And according to the legislation, that study needs to be running according to good clinical practice. But you have clinical data also which are already available on the market, which are actually coming from published data. You have clinical data which comes also from registry. You have clinical data which comes from real-world evidence, from your post-market experience. All of these sources are suitable to meet the requirement, but you need to first of all find them, identify them, and use them in a scientific way by challenging the good and bad quality data, and by presenting actually your approach to justify your safety and performance. And this is the problem that a lot of manufacturers are still struggling to present that approach in the right way, which is leading to a lot of questions. And we saw it already also by the expert panel, where some expert opinion were stating that the manufacturer has very complex documentation. Please make sure that actually whatever you are preparing, whatever you are preparing for yourself, make sure that it is readable. It's actually understandable for the third party, which could be a notified body or an expert panel, because this is actually the recipe for success. Don't write documents which you can't read by yourself, and don't submit documents before you read them by yourself. A lot of organizations write a document and submit because they are in a hurry, and this leads to a lot of trouble afterwards because they didn't read it and they didn't address what is expected. And we have helpful guidance documents out there in the European Union. And one of them, which is very helpful to understand, is my clinical evaluation, my clinical data sufficient, is actually the document which is going to be used by your notified body, which is the clinical evaluation assessment report, requiring notified bodies actually to assess your file and to conclude on whether the data are acceptable or not. And they have to conclude and understand based on your evidence. And there are devices which cannot be requiring a clinical investigation because they are a new class 3 or a new implantable device trying to enter the European market. But there are devices which might be able to justify that they have already sufficient clinical data based on the experience that they had on the market. And those devices will be using the post-market experience, the real-world evidence, prospective, retrospective data, published data, unpublished data, all kinds of information will be needed even so, the regulation is telling us we need to have published peer-reviewed data. It doesn't mean that you need to disregard all other data. No, you need to include all of them, but you need to have in your appraisal a consideration of what the legislation is telling us here and make sure that at the end, the analysis is actually reasonable and justifiable to allow a reviewer to come to a conclusion, which is similar to yours, making sure that the device which is entering the market is acceptable from a benefit-risk profile. Next slide, please. So in general, we are talking today about clinical data, clinical evaluation. And what is important is actually what would allow me to say that my data and my evidence are sufficient. And there are actually a lot of discussion about that. And this was actually from the beginning with the legislation. I remember when we had urgent meetings where people were screaming, oh my God, the European medical device regulation is telling us we need to have sufficient clinical evidence. What does it mean? How much is it sufficient? And I can tell you today, after many years of experience now with the MDR and its implementation, it remains the troublemaker. The fact that people are required to justify which level of evidence is sufficient. And the sufficiency will come from the amount as well as from the quality of the data and the coverage of that data. So you might have actually 10 devices in your portfolio, and all what you have are data related to one device. You might have 10 devices in your portfolio and you have data for all devices, but they do not cover the holistic population which you want to actually target for CE marking. And this is a question is, where can I get data? In a lot of cases, you did some studies, you didn't do by yourself studies, there were like investigator-initiated studies, there were some sponsored studies which are focused, and you got an approval under the MDD based on equivalency or other methodology. And now you come to the MDR, you are undergoing an initial certification from the beginning. And you know that your devices are used as such on the market, but you don't have access to those data. And I think what Khalid was mentioning at the beginning and the idea of the organization of 3Aware is to talk about a different source, which is actually the real-world evidence, and how this real-world evidence can help you close the gap, but also how real-world evidence can help you getting data for devices which are class 3 or are actually devices which are lower risk class, and you were not able to collect data because they are supportive devices. Take an example, you can have a guiding wire. You don't have that data from a study, or you can have a cannula. You don't have data from a study, or you have an implant and you have data for some of these implants, or you have data which are covering some of these population, and you know that that device under the directive was used widely. And the point is, how can I close the gap? And it is an initial certification, and the notified bodies will not accept a wide claim, or they would not accept a wide population without having evidence. And this is where you need to think about what would be my strategy. And we're going to see it in the next slide. What are actually the possibilities based on the legislation? Now, I mentioned real-world evidence. I mentioned real-world data. In Europe, we don't have that established in a system and a guidance at this moment. There is a lot of discussion around it. But if we look to the US system, the US FDA spoke a lot about real-world data and the usage of real-world data. And those are nothing else than actually the real data which you collect during a normal clinical procedure. Every hospital will collect data on a daily manner in million times, because they are treating the patient, they are collecting the data on the patient, and they are documenting that. I remember when I was working in a hospital, we did also studies at that time for PhD students where we looked to data, but we had to do that on a paperwork. We had to go by paper and trying to understand actually how many patients were treated with that device, trying to get the data which we are looking for retrospectively. It's a lot of work because you need to do it on a paperwork and you need to spend a lot of time. But there is a lot of valuable information out there where the scientific world actually spend a lot of time doing a lot of retrospective studies based on real-world data to make sure that there is a communication about long-term experience with devices. There is a communication about devices which were not studied in comparable way, but then they can compare actually what they have from their own data. And I think this is what we name real-world evidence. Can we go to the next slide, Khalid? So it's nothing else than actually the real usage of the device on the market, which has benefit, but it has also some limitations because it's not a prospective study, but it is actually based on what we have and what is the real world how the real world is making use of the device. The beauty of this kind of data is that there is no limitation with regard to which device the data will be collected for. And the other beauty is actually that you're going to have a huge number of users, huge number of devices, as well as you're going to be having actually data from multiple hospitals, which is very costly if you do it on a prospective way. But the prospective way has also some beauties, which we should not forget, which are very important from a scientific point of view. Next slide, please. Now, going back to the legislation and going back to the medical device regulation, what do we know from the regulation point of view? If we look to the medical device regulation, it was actually stated from the beginning that it is the obligation of the medical device manufacturer to define how much evidence is sufficient for my device. And to be able to define it, they need to actually have a clarity about their device. They need to have a clear statement, what is the intended purpose, which indication I'm targeting. They need to know why actually they are placing that device on the market, and they need to connect that with a justification on how much data would be necessary for my device. So the lawmakers actually gave you the flexibility to say, you define it, and the notified bodies in the European system will be actually challenging that approach by looking to your plan, by looking to what you have planned based on which justification. Next slide, please. So the process of clinical evaluation is nothing new. And I keep saying that, and a lot of people saw me talking about this since many years. It is actually a process which is established everywhere in the world in the same way. It's all about actually, I plan, I identify what I have, collect new data, challenge my data by appraising them, and build a conclusion if I can show that my device is safe, performing well, and build a conclusion on benefit risk profile, or I need to collect new data. It's a process which is circular because you could assume that you have enough data, but then you get into your data and you see you have data, but they are actually of bad quality, or they are not covering the full devices. So you need to initiate new studies or new activities to close that gap. And this could be like a new clinical investigation, or it could be that you're going to decide to say, I go back and check if I do a survey, or I go back and check perhaps with ReAware or other methodology, which would help me. At the end, you are actually in a preparation to submit your file to your notified body, and you want to justify that you have sufficient level of evidence. And this is where you need to check what would be actually the evidence need for my kind of device. And this is where your plan will play an important role. Next slide, please. And why I'm saying that, because it is actually the troublemaker in every single submission, which I'm seeing with notified bodies as of today with the medical device regulation, is actually manufacturer being very clear on what is the device intended for, who is the patient population and the indication that I'm trying to treat with my device. And on the next step is actually identifying the key safety and performance criteria from state of the art. This is an obligation. This is a methodology which started to be pushed by the MEDEF in 2016, where actually the MEDEF was adopted to clarify the methodology of clinical evaluation, that the benefit risk conclusion cannot be made based on a hope, on a wish, and an expectation of a manufacturer. It should be based on criteria which are extracted from the state of the art. And this is your starting point every time when you're preparing a clinical evaluation. You need to start understanding, for that intended purpose, for that indication, what are the criteria which would tell me that my device is safe and my device is performing well. And those criteria need to be extracted thoroughly from the state of the art, because based on that, you can decide which kind of evidence would be necessary for your kind of device and would allow you to say, actually, at the end, this is the way that would allow me to conclude and justify for the notified body or other organization that I'm meeting the requirements. Khalidip, I'm not sure, the slide disappeared from my screen. I'm not sure if this is the case for everyone.
We can see the slide, so please continue on.
Okay, So can we move to the next slide, please?
Yes, the identification of pertinent data.
Yes, I'm good. So I'm good with that. So with the MDCG 2020-6, we got actually a help from the legislator and the working group to which I belonged at that time, where we tried actually to help manufacturer of class 3 and implantable who wants us to move their devices from a directive to the MDR. And we created in the guidance in appendix a table which actually justify which level of evidence would be necessary for which kind of devices. And we differentiated between well-established technologies and legacy devices. So legacy devices which are well-established and devices which are not well-established or they are actually not legacy, if we want to look to it from that perspective. So you have a lot of situation. We discussed everything back and forth, and then we came to the agreement. If you have a heart valve or you have a hip implant, without having clinical data of good quality, it will not be acceptable or justifiable to allow such a device moving from directive to the regulation. So we said, actually, you need to have rank 1 to rank 4 data as a minimum to be able to move such a device to the market. But we said as well, if you have a guide wire or you have a cannula, or a catheter, which are belonging to a class 3 or an implantable classification, and they are a legacy product, but they are, let's say, well established, then we said it is not an obligation to have rank 1 to rank 4 data. You can have some of the data which are from rank 1 to rank 12, which can include a lot of various sources of data. And this is actually to help manufacturers, but it's not on the market that you just have these kind of devices. It's not, the problem is just not connected to class 3 and implantable devices. The problem of justifying sufficient level of evidence is connected to a lot of kind of devices. You might have a dialysis machine, you might have an oxygenator out there, you might have devices such as filters, you might have surgical instruments which are limited on data because there is no publication, the manufacturer didn't do a study in the past, and so on. So there is a necessity to look to it in a wider perspective, and I think this guidance help us have an idea about what the legislator accepted for class 3 and implantable devices and what can be actually transferred to other kind of devices. And this is a good methodology to understand what can be qualified as high quality data, high amount data, and what is actually qualified to be low level data, but is still acceptable for the kind of device that you are dealing with the class that you are dealing with. Next slide, please. So important for you as manufacturer always to think about understanding your device first and then openly looking to what kind of data are available. Don't misuse the regulation and the article of the regulation by stating my device doesn't require clinical data if you are a class 3 or an implantable device. I see a lot of manufacturers when they struggle and they recognize they have no data for their kind of device, then they try the approach of Article 6110 saying for that device, I don't need the clinical data. And then they get into trouble because the notified body will say, no, I reject that because based on the guidance, Article 6110 cannot be applied for class 3 or implantable devices. But if you widen your view and you check actually what kind of sources are there, you will find a lot of other kind of data which can be used. And don't forget the principle of indirect clinical evidence, which can be used, which is also part of the justification which were included in the MDCG 2020-6, which help manufacturers to have not just direct clinical data on their device, but that they can use as a source of data, indirect clinical data, such as, for example, for the guide wire, the data from the procedure on the stent implantation, where they can use the indirect data to justify that their guide wire is safe and performing as intended. And it doesn't mean that this is the only source. So the table which I presented before on the slide before from the Appendix 3 of the MDCG 2020-6 shall never be understood as one source of data would be sufficient. You're going to be using the combination to justify safety and performance. And the clinical evaluation is not just including one source of clinical evidence, it will include preclinical, bench, and clinical, which allow you to build a story about why your device is safe and performing as intended. And this is important and key for every person working on a clinical or clinical investigation level. Next slide, please. Now, I spoke about what is actually the current experience and the current actual recommendation with regard to clinical evaluation. But that recommendation also need to consider what will happen post-approval. And with the medical device regulation, there is a clear expectation on the lifetime of a device. Manufacturers are obliged to specify the expected lifetime of a device. And that expected lifetime would trigger a lot of activities in a post-market planning, but also in justifying how much evidence is sufficient for my device. Next slide, please. So in Europe, in the European legislation, there is a clear annex, which is Annex 14, telling us if you have a device, you need to build the PMCF plan, which is part of the PMS plan, so the post-market obligation. So when you submit to an organization, to a notified body for certification, they're going to ask you for the plan. They will not just accept your current clinical evidence. They want to understand what you're going to be doing after getting the device on the market. And by looking to that plan, they're going to look to what kind of data you provided at the time of submission and what is actually the expected lifetime of your device. And this PMCF will have actually a lot of additional values. And this PMCF is not just actually to fulfill a regulatory requirement. It will help you actually understanding unknowns. It will help you as well learning from the market and learning about a lot of aspects, such as actually things which you didn't consider during your R&D development, things which you didn't know about what could happen with the device with regard to usability, or as well the fact that some user might use that device out of off-label or misuse your device. All of this information will come from the post-market. And the post-market clinical follow-up could be a study, but it could be also other methodology, depending on what kind of data do you have, the characteristic of your device, and so on. So it's not just a prospective study. There is a lot of possibilities which can be used to address the post-market requirement. Next slide, please. Important is not to forget that each PMCF activity has actually a connected let's say, requirement, which is asking you, for example, to identify misuse. You would not do a clinical study to identify misuse of a device. You might be using, for example, real-world evidence or retrospective data to understand if the device was misused, or you would use even the literature for that. But if you are looking, for example, on confirming safety and performance, this could be a part where you're going to be doing registry, you're going to be doing a study, or you're going to be using a source of real-world evidence to support safety and performance of your device. And so you need to look to each section of the regulation, of the guidances, and try to justify why you use which methodology to address which requirement. And this is open by the legislation and given to you as manufacturer to select the right methodology and to consider in your selection a good justification why it is actually the best approach to address the requirement. If we go next slide, please. So considering all of that and considering the topic today, which was actually selected by 3Aware to talk about it, which is actually the importance of real-world evidence. Real-world evidence in general, so everything which you collect on a device help me in a lot of matters because it will help my R&D. It will help my marketing strategy. It will help me actually for the purpose of understanding my risk. A lot of manufacturers are still struggling with the initial risk that they have defined, the acceptance criteria for the risk management file, where they set actually at the development phase, but they never actually fed back with data from evidence on a post-market level. This process has to be assured that there is a connection between risk management, post-market, clinical. They need to talk to each other. And if they are talking to each other, but they are not getting data from a post-market level, and your risk estimate could be wrong now today because you didn't consider those data. So you need to check which source of data would help me actually having a more stable, more reasonable risk management file. But also your R&D team could get data with regard to the device, the usage of the device, which will help them understanding how they can actually develop a new product or improve the product as well as your clinical team will get information which would help them to understand, is the benefit risk conclusion still valid or not? So there is a lot of actually value out of that. And I think the ISO technical report 2416 help us actually with this graphical overview to understand what is behind the data that I'm getting from a post-market level. So a lot of people see post-market as an obligation, which is a punishment. It's not. It's actually a helpful a post-approval commitment and activity, which help me understanding my device, because everything which I do pre-market is nothing else than actually a good stomach feeling. The reality is actually what happens on the post-market level. This is where I get the majority of the data, and I get actually a better understanding of my device and the real usage of the device. Next slide, please. Now, I summarize a bit all the clinical requirement in a short presentation and spoke about actually what is the current situation. Now, the problem which happens in a lot of cases is the fact that you reach to your notified body, you submit your file, and you get a first deficiency telling you you are not delivering sufficient level of evidence, or you are not defining the criteria in the right way for performance and safety. It doesn't mean that actually your source of data is incorrect. It means that your strategy of submission, your plan, and your execution weren't correct. So therefore, a good strategy starts with a good planning. Plan your clinical evaluation from the beginning in the right way. Take my recommendation to identify key safety and performance criteria early in the stage, making sure what you need to answer as a question, and then select the right methodology for the data, which would allow you to answer those questions. Because if you select key safety and performance criteria and you look to your data and you see that they are not answering those, you will be in trouble. Then you better search for another methodology to collect data on those key safety and performance criteria, because everything else that you're going to do will not be justifiable to the notified body, and they will not take it. And even if your notified body would take it, you see already from the 10 opinions which were actually provided by the expert panel, sometimes the notified body will say, yes, I'm okay with your approach, but then the expert panel will say, I disagree. And this is, so you are undergoing for special devices, double scrutiny. So make sure that you have a suitable approach which you have selected, which makes sense, and avoid challenges which can come from the notified body or the expert panel afterwards. Because if you are impressed by your strategy and you did your work in the right way, then the level of challenges that you're going to be facing is limited because you prepared yourself accordingly. Next slide, please. Now, regardless which methodology you're going to be using, and especially if you're going to be using real-world evidence, important points to consider is the suitability of the data that you're going to be using. As I mentioned, if you have data on a pre-market, you have a data source on a pre-market or post-market level, you need to understand, can I, with this approach, address the questions? Then you need to ask yourself, is the data covering all kinds of devices, or do I need a different methodology on top of this? Is the amount of data sufficient? A lot of manufacturers comes and say, I have actually 10 devices in my portfolio. For this device, I just have 1 patient data. For that device, I have 200 patients. For that device, I have no patient, and so on. So you need to understand actually, is there a difference between actually the various population? Can I build a justification for transferring the data? Or do I need to study each device on each patient in a different way? So you need to look to all of these questions. You need to understand it first and then decide what would be actually sufficient for each of your 10 devices. And if you don't need data on each device, you better have a good justification for that. If you need data on each device, then you need to select the best methodology to address that requirement and to make sure that the notified body will accept it at the end. Quality of data, very important topic. Notified bodies challenge, if you get them a study or you get them a published data and you tell them that this data will be used, they're going to challenge the quality of the data. They're going to be looking to your appraisal approach. So you're going to try to understand, can I follow what you have justified? And again, they're going to connect that data with your key safety and performance criteria to see, are you answering the question that you said that you're going to answer? Now, it could be that you're going to have data, but the data are collected in China or in India or in the US, whatever. You need to consider as well, can I use those data to answer the European legislation? So the transferability of data is also an important part, and this should be considered by you as a manufacturer, because those questions will come to you. So if all your data are coming from a Chinese population, or coming from a population in India, or population in Arabic countries, you need to consider, is the device used in the same way in those countries? Is it approved for the same intended purpose, same indication? And is the population as well transferable to the European population? All of these questions need to be answered in your documentation. So don't answer them when they ask you. You need to answer all of these questions in your submission, ensuring that you will not get challenged at the end by questions which you cannot answer because you didn't consider them from the beginning. I hope I could help you understanding in a short presentation what is the requirement in Europe, and get some insight about what you need to consider when preparing yourself. And I'm open now for any question that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Akra, for the wonderful talk. And at this point, we do have questions coming in, and we also had some that occurred before the webinar. I'll just ask folks, if you have any questions, please include them in the Q&A portion. Type them into the Q&A portion on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. But let's start off with the first question. Is US sourced real-world data acceptable to notified bodies when building clinical evidence for EU files? And if so, what should be considered when justifying this to notified bodies?
So thank you for this question, Amelia. So taking that and considering what I mentioned during my presentation, there is no requirement in the European legislation which is stating that the data need to come from the European Union. The requirement is saying that the data should be relevant for the European Union and answering the question of the European legislation. So this said, you need, as a manufacturer, first of all, if you are using data from the US, to consider the standard, let's say, usage in the US and compare it to the European usage. Then you need to see, so the clinical practice. Then you need to check the population, see if there are differences in population between Europe and the US. And then you need to look to the suitability of the data and the relevance by looking to whether those data sources that you're going to be using are answering your question on key safety and performance. So it's not just sufficient to have data. You need to have the right data to answer the questions which are to be answered for your kind of device. This is important to be able to fulfill the requirement. Now, it depends on the device and the kind of device that you are dealing with and the transferability justifications that you provide. You might be still required to have a post-market commitment, but like I said, it's a case by case. But you need to show first that those data are transferable to Europe by delivering a scientific justification, which is not just based on I believe and I hope. It should be scientifically valid.
Thank you. Also, we have some questions about whether or not these slides will be available and that the recording will be available after today. The answer is yes. Those will be made available to all participants at the end of the webinar. The second question for you, Dr. Akra, is when let's see here, when following a clinical route for collecting evidence, do all safety and performance outcome parameters need to be considered in the evaluation based on the state of the art, or can manufacturers selectively capture the outcome parameters that they are planning to show conformity with? For example, can they list all the parameters but choose to show conformity as feasible or not?
So, so you mean they did the thorough state-of-the-art review, and then they came to the conclusion that actually they have, let's say, 5 key safety, 5 key performance criteria, and then they say out of that we just pick 1 or 2 to show evidence to them? The answer is no. So you cannot cherry pick. So if your state-of-the-art conclusion led to whatever number of key safety and performance criteria, then they have to be supported by evidence and used to build the benefit risk profile.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question.
Can I add to this, Amelia?
Oh,
now,
sure.
important point is, like, it doesn't mean that you need to get the data from one source on all of them. So you might have multiple sources which allow you to answer those questions, because it might be that some of the data out there are not answering those questions, but you might use a different source where you can justify that that source would help you actually covering that question.
Thank you. And can that be considered a gap that can be bridged through PMCF?
Important to consider, PMCF is never a replacement for a pre-market data requirement. So at the time when you get an approval, at that time, you need to show that your key safety and performance criteria are supported by evidence. Now, what you need to consider, PMCF could be, for example, in case you have a device which is a long-term implantable device, you define the expected lifetime, let's say to say 10 years is the expected lifetime. You come to the notified body and all what you have at the time for MDR certification, even so you have been since 10 years on the market, are 3 years data. Then you can actually, you don't need to have 10 years data at the time of submission. This can be covered then by PMCF because you have 3 years and you have a PMCF plan which is covering the expected lifetime, then it's fine for the notified bodies.
Thank you. All right, another question we have that's come in. Can you define what unpublished data includes? For example, does data presented at a conference, study, or abstracts account for this? And they also stated very often this data is not a full publication, giving very little information on safety and performance. And it may be months or before it gets published, or it may never get published. So should this be reviewed and included in clinical evidence or excluded until a full publication is available?
So if you have the sorry, if you have these kind of data, regardless where the data source is, what the data source is, this is why you have in a clinical evaluation process the so-called appraisal. So you get the data, you need to consider them, but they will be potentially disqualified of being evidence for the benefit risk profile because of their low quality as let's say abstract data or limited information. But if you get from these abstracts, for example, information like your device is killing a patient or harming a patient, they have to be considered in your risk management. So you cannot disregard them. So you need to do some kind of separation between what kind of evidence will be allowing you to justify safety and performance, and what kind of evidence would need to be actually considered for your risk management and risk conclusion, because it's a signal, even if it's not really qualitative, it's still a signal. So you need to consider it, but it cannot be actually the main evidence for your justification of a positive benefit risk conclusion.
Thank you. All right. Next, we have a participant who asked if you have a device such as a Class 3 delivery system, which has been certified under MDR, having sufficient level of clinical data, but then there's a material or design change that's planned. Is it reasonable to use existing clinical data along with bench testing to demonstrate safety and performance of the change, or the device with the change, and not to have to complete a new clinical study, registry, or survey?
So a material change is actually a challenge with the medical device regulation, and it depends on what kind of material change you are implementing. Because if you take the law as is today, it's expecting the same kind of material to be used. And this is the big challenge with regard to the various notified bodies and interpretation. The majority of notified bodies are actually expecting same to be 100% the same. And now you could have a change in material which is not impacting safety and performance. Now, the MDR allows for a Class 3 and implantable device to undergo a modification to an already approved device. This is Article 61.4. But 61.4 says, if the notified body accepts the equivalency, so let's say the notified body would say the material is the same or is different, but it's acceptable for me, they are required based on this article to enforce the PMCF study. So you will not be able to avoid like an activity on data collection on that specific device. So even if you avoid it on a pre-market level, you get an enforcement on a post-market level.
Thank you.
But the study is actually a PMCF study if you look to the definition and the wording of the guidances, it could be a registry, it could be other methodology as well. So it's not always just a prospective ISO 14155 study. It could be actually other kind of data collection method, which is active and systematic.
Thank you. And that's actually a good segue into another question we had, which was for a PMCF study or specific methods, active study, do you need to apply ISO 14155 fully, or can it be applied in part? For example, if the study is real world evidence and the informed consent will not be signed by the subject.
So it depends on what you are doing actually as an activity. You need to justify. So 14155 is actually have a scope and has a coverage to which activities will be covered by that standard. Now, it is a use acceptable current practice to say this is actually what would qualify an activity to be high quality. Now, you might have some deviation from that standard because the methodology is not part of the scope of that standard, and therefore, you might decide to say, I use a different method, and my justification why I'm still high quality is because of this and that. So you need to have a good story behind it. So it's not just that you don't want to do it because you are lazy. You need to make sure that you are not doing this because it's not possible for that kind of method, and you explain it and justify it. And every notified body reviewer will understand that approach if you give them like a solid justification for why you are deviating from the current state-of-the-art standard.
Okay, so we probably have time for one more question. I do want to say we have a lot of great questions coming in, but we do want to be respectful of everyone's time. Please feel free to reach out afterwards. Our contact info will be available on the slides that you'll have access to after this meeting. But for the last question, Dr. Akra, and this was asked a couple times here, is it possible for real-world data on a product used off-label to support an expanded indication for the device?
So this is a very good question because of the European, if we look to the European legislation, so in the US, yes, it is possible. The US system is allowing that. The European system didn't consider that for this moment. Now it is under discussion. There is a lot of working group which are talking about that because at the end those data are collected, and if they are coming from real world evidence, they should be considered because the legislation expects us to consider all available clinical data. But at this moment, there is no pathway based on the legislation or the guidance, which is saying if you get real world evidence which are off-label, you can use them to expand your indication. The current Annex 14 of the medical device regulation requires manufacturer on a post-market level to identify off-label use and misuse with the intention to review the intended purpose of the device. So they tell us indirectly, you need to check, is my intended purpose correct? But the current system is actually telling us to check it with regard to mitigate the fact that people are using the device off-label. And the hope is that one day, the European legislator will open themselves to say, out of real-world evidence, we are open to accept that off-label use data as a source to expand the indication.
Great, thank you. All right.
Emilia, I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, we do? Okay. Let's see. Here's one. So there's a bit of confusion or potential conflation regarding lifetime. Does the notified body or commission interpret data needed for lifetime specific to the use of a single device and the safety performance of that usage? Or do you have to plan PMCF data, specific activities throughout the entire commercialization of that product family?
Oh, very, very good point. So you need to differ between post-market surveillance, which is the general activities that you do, like complaints management and so on, which has to run over the entire lifetime of a product. But the clinical data collection, so PMCF, would be connected to the expected lifetime of a device. So let's say I'm designing a stent, or I'm designing a pacemaker, And I defined the expected lifetime to be 10 years for that pacemaker. And at the time of submission, I have 2 years data. Then I need to present to the notified body a PMCF plan, which is not talking actually about the holistic commercialization plan, but it's talking, this will be a PMS plan, which is talking about how I'm gonna survey the market. But my PMCF will cover actually my 10 years period. Now, you need to take due consideration to your change management, because if you have a device today and you say, for that device, I'm planning that I will do a registry for 5 years, I will do after 10 years a retrospective study. You can have a combination of methodology, and I'm doing real-world evidence to confirm safety and performance. You can have multiple methods. And then after 4 years, you redesign the device or you adopt the design influencing the safety and performance of that device. Then you need to start the plan again for new 10 years because it is already invalid what you have collected and you need to collect new data. So this is an iterative process, but there is no expectation that you need to collect data forever. It doesn't make sense. And there is no methodology which will allow you to collect data forever unless actually real-world evidence then, but there is not such a requirement in the European system. Now, you could do it because of your interest, but it's not an obligation based on the rules that you have to do it forever.
Thank you. Okay. Well, at this time, I'm going to turn the platform back over to Khalid.
So thank you. So first of all, thank you to the audience. We have audiences from Japan, from Europe, from the United States, about 300 all, and it's all actually testament to Dr. Akra's reputation. So I would like to begin by thanking you, Dr. Akra, for today's wonderful presentation. This will be made available via a link and the PDF slides that I'll send over to you. And for those of you who want to reach out to us for more personalized demonstration of 3Ware's capabilities specific to your product lines, please feel free to reach out to me. With that, I would like to bring this webinar to a close and thank you all for attending. Bye-bye and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.